Hey folks. I never thought I'd be one of those guys sharing my life story on the internet, but here I am. I've got a tale to tell, and it's been burning in my chest for too long. I figure if anyone would get a kick out of it, it'd be you fine folks here. I guess I'll start with my name, Ethan. Just Ethan, nothing fancy. I'm a sailor, or at least I was until a few months ago. My life was the sea, and I don't mean that in some romanticized, man against the ocean, kind of way. It was just life. Work. Salt in my hair, diesel in my nose, and the steady hum of an old trawler under my feet. I worked on a cargo ship, the Windrider. Yeah, the name's kind of lame, but the old girl had spirit. We ran supplies up and down the coast, nothing glamorous. You'd be surprised how many things need moving across the water instead of on roads. Cheaper, I guess. Anyway, I was the deckhand, which is basically a glorified janitor, handyman, and grunt all rolled into one. Everything changed on what was supposed to be a routine run from Savannah to Norfolk. The Atlantic was being a bit of a brat that week, choppy waves, gray skies, the kind of cold that digs under your clothes and sets up camp in your bones. We were maybe 30 miles off the coast when the radio crackled with distress. Small fishing boat, engine dead, no power, a couple of guys on board. The captain, Mike, stout guy, always had a toothpick in his mouth, didn't hesitate. He barked orders, and before I knew it, we were cutting through the waves toward the coordinates. The sea was pissed off, slapping our hull, and making every step on deck a gamble. When we finally reached the boat, it was worse than I imagined. A little thing, maybe 20 feet long, bobbing like a cork in the storm. Two guys on board, one waving his arms like he was trying to swat a wasp, the other slumped over the side, barely conscious. Mike yelled at me to get a line over. I didn't think, just acted. I threw the rope, felt the tug when they caught it, and helped haul them in. The first guy scrambled aboard, soaked and shivering, thanking us between gasps. The second guy was in bad shape. Young, maybe early 20s, his lips blue and eyes half closed. I wrapped him in a blanket, held him while the ship's medic checked his pulse. The medic, an old Navy guy named Harris, muttered something about hypothermia. I just focused on keeping the kid warm, talking to him, keeping him awake. Hey, man, stay with me. What's your name? He blinked, slow and sluggish. Kyle. We got him below deck, got him dry, and Harris did his thing. Over the next few hours, Kyle came back to life, color returning to his cheeks, his voice steadying. I sat with him, brought him hot soup, and kept him company. He told me they'd been out for a quick fishing trip, just him and his buddy, Jesse, the guy who'd been waving at us. Engine died, phone died, everything died. They thought they'd be a headline by morning. By the time we docked in Norfolk, Kyle was walking on his own, a little wobbly but alive. When they left, he shook my hand so hard I thought he might break it. I figured that was the end of it. Just another rescue, another story to tell over beers with the crew. I didn't expect the call a week later. A woman's voice, soft and clear, with this polite confidence that you don't hear often. Is this Ethan? Yeah. Who's this? My name is Emily. I'm Kyle's sister. You saved his life. Her voice cracked on the last word, and I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, feeling like a deer in headlights. That's how it started. I had no idea where it would lead. So, after that call from Emily, I spent a good hour just staring at my phone. Her voice lingered in my mind, soft but with this undercurrent of strength. She'd asked if we could meet so she could thank me properly, and I'd stammered out a yes before my brain could catch up. A few days later, I found myself in the kind of coffee shop I'd usually avoid. You know the type, exposed brick, leather couches, the hum of indie music in the background. The air smelled like roasted beans and money. I'd pulled on my cleanest shirt, a worn denim button-up, and hoped I didn't look like I'd just climbed off a ship, even though I pretty much had. Emily walked in, and I swear, the room shifted. She wasn't movie star beautiful, not that plastic, airbrushed look, but there was something real about her. Brown hair that curled at the ends, a few freckles on her cheeks, and eyes the color of a clear sky. She wore a simple green dress, the kind that looked effortless but probably cost more than my month's rent. "Ethan?" She smiled, and I felt my pulse stumble. "Yeah, that's me." I stood, awkwardly offering a hand, which she shook with a gentle but firm grip. We sat, and for the first few minutes, it was mostly her thanking me, and me trying to downplay it. "I just did what anyone would," I said. "But you didn't. You were there, and you acted. You saved my brother." Her voice softened, and she looked at me with this earnestness that made my face feel warm. She told me about Kyle, how he was the youngest in the family, the baby of the bunch. How he'd always been a bit of a wild card, more at home on the water than in any classroom or office. Their family was old money, she explained, but Kyle had always resisted the mold. I could see that, the way he'd clung to that little fishing boat, even when it nearly killed him. We ended up talking for over an hour. She asked about my life, and I told her the truth. Born and raised in a small coastal town, my dad a mechanic, my mom a waitress. I'd taken to the sea young, working on boats, learning the ropes. No fancy degrees, no impressive titles, just hard work and a bit of grit. When we finally stood to leave, she hesitated. "I'd like to see you again," she said. "If you'd like that too." I nodded, probably too eagerly. "Yeah, I'd like that." That was how it began. We met a few more times, always in her world, at first. Art galleries, charity events, restaurants where the menu didn't even list the prices. I felt out of place, a sailor among suits and silk dresses, but Emily never made me feel lesser. She'd slip her arm through mine, guide me through the crowds, and talk to me like I was the only person in the room. But the contrast between us was impossible to ignore. Her friends were polished, with perfect smiles and subtle, probing questions. "So, what do you do?" they'd ask, their eyes darting to my rough hands, the calluses and scars from years of work. "I'm a sailor," I'd say, and watch their expressions tighten, polite but dismissive. One night, after a particularly rough evening at a cocktail party, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, staring at my own reflection. I looked tired, worn. I could see every hour of hard labor etched into my skin, every storm I'd weathered. I needed to change. Not for her, but for me. If I wanted to hold my own in her world, I had to step up. I started small. Got a part-time job at a marina, less grunt work, more customer-facing stuff. I borrowed books from the library, classic literature, history, anything that could broaden my mind. I'd read until my eyes burned, highlighting words I didn't know, looking them up and repeating them until they stuck. I enrolled in night classes at the community college. Nothing fancy, just basic business and communication courses. I wanted to be able to talk to her friends without feeling like I was speaking a different language. Emily noticed. She never pushed, but she'd smile when I'd mention something I'd learned, her eyes bright with pride. "You're incredible," she'd say, her voice soft, and I'd feel like maybe, just maybe, I could bridge the gap between our worlds. But nothing worth having comes easy, and life, as always, had a few surprises waiting around the corner. The first real test came when Emily invited me to her parents' place for dinner. She called it dinner, but it felt more like an audition. Her family lived in a sprawling colonial-style house outside of Richmond. The kind of place with manicured lawns, a driveway that wound through trees, and a front door big enough to drive my old beat-up truck through. I'd picked up a decent blazer from a thrift store, something dark and simple. Emily said I looked great, but I still felt like a kid playing dress-up. Her parents, Richard and Margaret, were exactly what I expected, elegant, composed, and sharp. Richard had this quiet intensity, a silver-haired guy with a handshake that tested my grip. Margaret was polite, but her smile never quite reached her eyes. They led us into a dining room that could have hosted a small wedding. The table was set with crystal glasses, silverware lined up like soldiers. A chandelier hung above, its light scattering across polished wood and old paintings. Dinner started fine. We talked about the weather, the latest art exhibit Emily had curated, and some local charity gala they were hosting. But it wasn't long before Richard's questions turned my way. "So, Ethan," he began, swirling his wine glass, "Emily mentioned you work at the marina. Do you plan to stay there long term?" His voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it, like he was peeling back layers to see what lay underneath. "I'm taking night classes," I said. "Looking to move into something more stable. Maybe management, eventually." "Management." He nodded, but the word hung in the air, heavy. "And before the marina? You were a sailor, right?" I swallowed a sip of water, my throat suddenly tight. "Yeah. Worked on cargo ships mostly. Did a bit of everything, maintenance, logistics, whatever needed doing." Margaret's fork clinked against her plate. "That must have been challenging." "It was. But it taught me a lot." Emily reached under the table, her hand finding mine. Her touch was warm, but her fingers tensed as if bracing for impact. "What are your long-term plans?" Richard asked. "For your career, for your future." The table seemed to shrink. I could feel every eye on me, every breath. "I'm still figuring that out," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I want to build something solid. To make a life I can be proud of." Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's good to hear. Stability is important." The rest of the evening was a blur of small talk and measured smiles. When we finally left, I could breathe again. In the car, Emily was quiet. I drove with my hands tight on the wheel, the road ahead a dark ribbon cutting through the night. "You okay?" I asked. "Yeah." She hesitated. "They just need time. You know how they are." I nodded, but a part of me felt raw, exposed. I wasn't good enough, not yet. The days rolled on, and I threw myself into work and studying. I got promoted at the marina, nothing huge, but I was now managing the docks, handling schedules, and dealing with clients. It felt like progress. Emily and I kept seeing each other, but the gap between our worlds never really closed. I'd meet her at art events and fundraisers, and then I'd go home to my tiny apartment with peeling wallpaper and the hum of a busted radiator. She'd sit in on my study sessions, curled up on my couch, while I wrestled with business textbooks that felt like they were written in another language. And then, out of nowhere, life threw a curveball. One afternoon at the marina, a guy showed up, a client looking to rent a slip for his boat. He was in his 40s, wearing a tailored jacket over a polo shirt, the kind of guy who looked like he spent his weekends golfing. His name was Tom, and he struck up a conversation while I helped him with paperwork. Turns out, he ran a small shipping company, freight logistics, mostly. He'd been having trouble finding reliable staff, and before I knew it, I was telling him about my time on the Windrider, about managing crew and schedules. "Why don't you come by the office?" he said, handing me his card. "We might have something for you." I walked home with that card burning a hole in my pocket. It felt like a door cracking open, just a sliver, but enough to see the light on the other side. That night, over takeout and textbooks, I told Emily about it. She sat up, her eyes wide and bright. "You have to go," she said. "This could be huge." "Yeah, but what if?" "No," she leaned in, her hands on mine. "Ethan, you're incredible. You deserve this." And for the first time in a long while, I started to believe it too. When I walked into Tom's office, it felt like stepping onto another planet. The building was this glass and steel structure in the heart of the city, a place where everything hummed with purpose. I'd never seen so many people in tailored suits, all of them moving with that quick, decisive stride of folks who had somewhere important to be. Tom's office was on the 5th floor. His assistant, a young guy in a crisp shirt, led me down a hallway lined with framed photographs of container ships, warehouses, and bustling ports. The whole place smelled like coffee and fresh paper. Tom greeted me with a firm handshake and a warm grin. "Ethan, glad you made it." We sat in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the river. The view was something else, gray water snaking through the city, cranes and freighters moving like giants on the horizon. He didn't waste time. "I need someone who knows the ropes," he said. "We've got a small fleet, mostly coastal runs, and I need a logistics coordinator. Someone who can manage schedules, handle crews, and make sure everything runs smooth." It sounded like a lot, but as he talked, I realized I already knew most of it. My years on the Windrider, the long nights wrestling with ledgers at the marina, all of it had built this foundation I hadn't even known I was laying. We talked numbers. The salary he offered was more than I'd ever made, with room to grow. He needed an answer by the end of the week, but I didn't need that long. "When can I start?" I asked. Tom laughed, clapped me on the back. "That's the spirit. How about Monday?" I walked out of that office feeling 10 feet tall. The city buzzed around me, taxis and buses, the smell of food from street vendors, the slap of footsteps on concrete. I found a quiet spot by the river, sat on a cold metal bench, and let it sink in. I texted Emily, "I got the job." She called immediately, her voice bright and full of joy. I knew it. "Ethan, this is amazing." We met that evening at her apartment. It was a cozy place in a brick building with ivy climbing the walls. Her place was warm, filled with soft light and the smell of vanilla candles. She hugged me tight, and for the first time, I felt like I was stepping into her world as an equal. The new job was a whirlwind. I went from scrubbing decks to wearing a company badge, sitting in on meetings, and coordinating shipments. The work was hard, the hours long, but it felt good. Real. I'd get up before the sun, take the subway into the city, and dive into schedules, spreadsheets, and port logistics. I was learning something new every day, pushing myself, proving myself. Emily and I grew closer. She'd stop by the office sometimes, bringing me lunch or just a few minutes of escape from the grind. Her parents, though, remained a wall I couldn't quite get over. We'd visit them occasionally, and while they were always polite, there was a coolness there, a polite distance. One evening, after another strained dinner, Richard pulled me aside. "Ethan," he began, his voice low. "I respect what you're trying to do. You've come a long way. But Emily has a future, one that involves stability, comfort. You need to ask yourself if you can truly provide that." It felt like a punch to the gut. I nodded, mumbled something about understanding, and left with Emily's hand in mine. She knew something was wrong. We walked back to my apartment, her heels clicking on the pavement, the city a blur of lights and shadows around us. "What did he say to you?" she asked. "Nothing I didn't already know." She stopped, tugged me to face her. "Ethan, don't. You've worked so hard. You've earned this." "Have I?" I ran a hand through my hair. "Your dad's right. I'm still playing catch-up. I'm not like you, Em. I never will be." Her face softened, and she stepped closer. "I don't want you to be like me. I want you to be you. The guy who saved my brother, who built himself up from nothing. That's who I love." The words hung between us, warm and real. It was the first time she'd said it. The first time I'd heard it, not just with my ears but with my heart. "I love you too," I said, and when I kissed her, it felt like the world was finally clicking into place. But love wasn't enough to stop life from testing us. A month into the job, a shipment went sideways. A storm hit the coast, and one of our freighters got delayed. The client was furious, threatening to pull contracts. Tom was breathing down my neck, the office buzzing with tension. I worked late, barely slept. I called in every favor I had, coordinating crews, pushing through paperwork, making sure the cargo got where it needed to go. It was a week of hell, but we pulled through. The shipment landed, the client cooled off, and Tom slapped me on the back with a grin. "That was impressive, Ethan. You saved our asses." It felt good, no, it felt incredible. Not just the praise but knowing I'd earned it. I wasn't just a sailor anymore. I was part of something bigger, something I was building with my own two hands. Emily was there through it all. Late nights at my place, takeout boxes stacking up, her soft presence keeping me grounded. But life, as always, had another wave ready to crash over me. Things were finally starting to settle. My role at Tom's company had solidified. I wasn't just the new guy anymore. I was handling major logistics, managing crews, and even sitting in on strategy meetings. The work was tough, but I thrived on it. There was something satisfying about the organized chaos of shipping, hundreds of moving parts, all needing to click into place. Emily and I were in a good place too. Her parents remained a distant, polite presence, but it didn't matter as much anymore. We built our own little world, lazy Sunday mornings, late-night conversations, and quiet dinners in my apartment, surrounded by half-read books and her sketches scattered on the coffee table. But as always, life had a way of testing the strength of the hull. One rainy afternoon, I got a call from my old captain, Doug. His voice crackled over the line, rough as ever. "Ethan, I need a favor." He explained that the Windrider was in trouble. One of the deckhands had gotten injured, and they were short-staffed for a run down to the Gulf. They were hauling emergency supplies, storm relief goods to a coastal town hit by a hurricane. "I wouldn't ask," he said, "but I've got no one else. It's a week, maybe 10 days. Pay's decent, too." I hesitated. The new job had me tied up, but I owed Doug. He'd given me a shot when I had nothing. And there was something about getting back on the water that stirred a part of me I thought I'd left behind. I talked to Tom about it. To my surprise, he didn't just understand, he encouraged it. "We'll manage without you for a week," he said. "And hey, you might learn something useful out there." Emily, though, wasn't thrilled. "You've worked so hard to get here," she said, her arms crossed as rain pattered against my apartment window. "Why risk it? It's not about risk. It's about doing the right thing." She looked at me, her expression a mix of worry and something else I couldn't quite read. "I just don't want you to slip back into that old life. I need you here, Ethan." I kissed her, held her close. "I'll come back. I promise." The Windrider hadn't changed much. The same creaking wood, the same salt-stained ropes. The crew had a few new faces, but the rhythm of the ship was the same. It felt good, natural. Like slipping on an old, worn-in jacket. The run south was rough. The storm had left the coast a mess, boats thrown onto streets, debris in the water, everything gray and battered. We spent long days hauling crates, setting up temporary shelters, and coordinating with local relief teams. It was hard work, but it felt good. Honest. The kind of work where you see the impact right in front of you, families getting food, kids laughing as they played on the sand, even with the world around them in ruins. But the sea is never without risk. On the trip back, the weather turned. The forecast had called for mild rain, but by nightfall, it was a full-blown squall. Waves hammered the hull, rain lashed the deck, and the Windrider groaned with every swell. Doug had us all on deck, running lines, securing cargo, shouting over the roar of the wind. I slipped, smashed my shoulder against a railing, but the adrenaline kept me moving. At one point, I found myself at the bow, holding a line as the ship pitched forward. Water crashed over me, cold and sharp, and for a moment, I felt that old fear. The raw, primal terror of the sea. But I held on. I wasn't that lost sailor anymore. I had a purpose, a life waiting for me on the other side of the storm. By dawn, the storm had passed. The windrider was battered, but we were still afloat. Doug slapped me on the back, his grin wide despite the cut above his eyebrow. Hell of a night, eh? I laughed, breathless, staring out at the gray horizon. Yeah. Hell of a night. When we finally docked, I was exhausted, bone-deep tired. I called Emily as soon as my feet hit solid ground. She answered on the second ring, her voice tight with worry. "You're okay." "I'm good. We're back." There was a pause, a soft exhale. "I missed you." "I missed you too. I'll be home soon." I dragged myself back to my apartment, showered, and fell into bed. When I woke, Emily was there, sitting in the chair by the window, a book in her lap. She smiled when she saw me, and everything else faded away, the storm, the cold, the fear. "I thought you'd sleep forever," she said, standing and slipping into bed beside me. I pulled her close, my hands still rough from the ropes, her skin soft and warm. "I'm home." The week away had changed something. I felt clearer, more grounded. The job at Tom's was waiting, and I was ready to dive back in. Emily and I fell into a rhythm, and even her parents seemed to ease up a bit. It felt like I'd passed a test. Like I'd earned my place in this new life. But I knew enough to stay ready. The sea, life, both had a way of testing you when you least expected it. The months that followed were a blur of hard work and quiet moments. I threw myself into my job at Tom's company, taking on more responsibility, earning the trust of my colleagues. I even started leading a few small projects, coordinating shipments from start to finish. There was a sense of satisfaction in seeing things through, knowing that every crate, every manifest, had my fingerprints on it. Emily and I were stronger than ever. We spent weekends exploring the city, finding tucked-away coffee shops, wandering through art exhibits, and spending long afternoons at the riverfront. Her sketchbook was always with her, filled with quick lines and smudges that captured the world as she saw it, raw and beautiful. One chilly evening, we were curled up on my couch, a blanket draped over our legs, when she turned to me. "Have you ever thought about the future?" Her question hung in the air, soft but heavy. "Yeah," I said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I think about it all the time." "What do you see?" I hesitated, not because I didn't know but because I did. "I see you. Us. Maybe a little house. A life that feels real, like this." Her smile was small, genuine. "I want that too." I didn't say it then, but I started saving. Every paycheck, I put a bit aside, building a small, quiet pile for something important. Things at work kept picking up. Tom started bringing me into bigger meetings, talking about long-term strategies, even asking my opinion on new routes and partnerships. I felt like I was finally carving out a space for myself in this world. But with more responsibility came more challenges. One of our biggest clients, a tech company shipping electronics overseas, had a shipment delayed. Some customs paperwork had gotten messed up, and suddenly we were facing fines and potential contract issues. I stayed late at the office, poring over documents, making calls, and working with our legal team to untangle the mess. Emily brought me dinner, sitting beside me in the dim light of my cubicle, her presence a quiet comfort. We pulled through, and Tom's praise was genuine. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Ethan. Keep this up, and I see big things in your future." Emily and I started talking more seriously about what we wanted. She'd been getting offers from galleries, small showcases where she could display her art. The idea of it made her both excited and nervous, but I encouraged her every step of the way. Her first showing was a small affair at a converted warehouse. The walls were white, the floors polished concrete, and her sketches hung in simple frames. People drifted through, murmuring to each other, sipping cheap wine. I watched from the corner as she talked to strangers, her hands moving as she explained her work, her eyes bright. She looked so alive, so at home in this world. When the evening wound down, and the last guest had left, I found her sitting on a bench outside, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "How does it feel?" I asked. She looked up at me, her breath visible in the cool night air. "Like the beginning of something." We walked home, our fingers intertwined, and I knew that whatever happened next, we were in it together. But life had one more test waiting. A month later, Tom called me into his office. His expression was serious, the lines around his mouth deeper than usual. "We're expanding," he said. "New routes, new opportunities. I need someone to oversee operations on the West Coast." The offer was incredible, a promotion, a significant pay bump, and a chance to really make a name for myself. But it also meant leaving. Moving across the country, starting fresh. Emily and I talked about it for hours. She sat on my bed, her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes searching mine. "It's an amazing opportunity," she said. "But I can't go. Not now. Not with the gallery showing interest in my work." We were at a crossroads. I could see it in the space between us, the way the room felt colder, sharper. "I don't want to lose you," I said. "Then don't go," she whispered. But the offer sat in my mind, heavy and tempting. I could see the path it would open up, the career, the stability, the promise of something more. In the end, I made my choice. I turned down the promotion. Tom didn't understand, not fully. But he respected it. "You've got your priorities straight," he said, clapping me on the back. And that's rare. When I told Emily, she cried, not sad tears, but the kind that wash away fear and doubt. "You did that for me." I did it for us. After that, things fell into place. Emily's art took off. Her sketches started showing up in galleries, then coffee shops, then small art publications. I stayed at Tom's company, and eventually, he offered me a different promotion, one that didn't require leaving. On a warm spring evening, under the soft glow of fairy lights in our favorite park, I got down on one knee. The ring wasn't flashy, but it was real, just like us. She said yes. As we sat on the cool grass, her head on my shoulder, I couldn't help but think about how far we'd come. From that stormy night on the Windrider to now, our futures braided together, strong and steady. There was only one thing left to do, figure out how to celebrate the wedding. Planning a wedding was nothing like I'd expected. I thought it would be simple, just Emily, me, and a handful of close friends. But as soon as the word got out, it turned into something bigger. Tom insisted on hosting a rehearsal dinner at his lakeside house, and Emily's parents, to my surprise, wanted to contribute. Her mom, Linda, who had once barely concealed her distaste for me, sat down with us over coffee and suggested a venue, a beautiful, rustic barn on the edge of town, surrounded by fields that turned gold in the summer. "I want this to be special for you too," she said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard. "We'd like to help, if you'll let us." Emily squeezed my hand under the table, and I nodded. "We'd love that." In the months leading up to the wedding, life settled into a sweet rhythm. I moved up at Tom's company, taking on new responsibilities without the weight of a cross-country move hanging over me. Emily's art was flourishing, her pieces now hung in galleries I couldn't have imagined stepping into a year ago. We found a little house on the edge of the city, with creaky floors and a wild, overgrown garden. It wasn't much, but it was ours. Every weekend, we'd tackle a new project, painting the kitchen, building bookshelves, taming the garden into something that resembled order. The wedding day came on a clear autumn afternoon. The barn was draped in soft white linens, and fairy lights hung from the rafters, casting a warm, golden glow. Our friends filled the rows of simple wooden chairs, Tom and his wife, the old crew from the Windrider, Emily's art friends with their colorful scarves and sketchbooks. As I stood at the altar, the world seemed to narrow, focusing on the double barn doors as they swung open. Emily stepped through, her dress simple and flowing, her hair in loose waves. She looked like a painting, something timeless and real. My heart thudded in my chest as she walked toward me, her eyes never leaving mine. The ceremony was short, filled with quiet laughter and a few teary smiles. When she said, "I do," the world seemed to shift, locking into place, every uncertainty and hardship leading us here, to this moment. The reception spilled out onto the field, long tables set under the open sky. The food was nothing fancy, barbecue, fresh bread, bowls of colorful salads, but it was perfect. We danced on the grass, our shoes kicked off, the earth cool beneath our feet. At one point, I found myself standing on the edge of the field, a glass of cider in hand, watching as Emily twirled under the lights, her laugh ringing out above the music. Tom joined me, clinking his glass against mine. "You did good, Ethan." I nodded, a lump in my throat. "I feel like I finally made it." He chuckled. "You've been making it for a while now. It just took you a bit to see it." As the night wore on, the guests thinned out, and it was just us, our closest friends, the stars above, and the last crackling embers of the bonfire. Emily sat beside me, her head on my shoulder, a blanket wrapped around us. "Where do you think we'll go from here?" she asked. I didn't need to think about it. "Anywhere we want." We talked about our dreams, about maybe taking a trip, seeing the ocean from the deck of a ship without ropes in our hands or storms in the sky. About more art shows, maybe even opening a small gallery of her own. About building a life where every day felt like this, warm, safe, real. And as the fire died down, and the night settled in, I felt it, a quiet, unshakable certainty. The storms were behind us, and the horizon was wide open.